You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
Because of the following special program, Wonder Woman and the Incredible Hulk will not be presented this evening.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Making Tracks. Here are your hosts, Mark Newbold and Mark Mulcaster.
That's not true. That's impossible.
You're listening to Making Tracks. I'm your co-host Mark Newbold, and joining us today is a very special guest, Gary Whitta. You'll know Gary as one of the co-developers of the story for Rogue One. He was also involved as the co-writer in After Earth with M. Night Shyamalan. He was the screenwriter of the Book of Eli. He's done all sorts of other incredible stuff. He's writing stuff for DC right now, and he's also behind a new venture called Gundog. Myself, Mark Mulcaster, Gary Whitta, talking all about Star Wars, Rogue One, all kinds of good stuff here on Making Tracks. Gary, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Now, Gundog, give us a bit of the layout of what it's about, what the premise is, and where people can find it as well.
It's a new original thing that I'm doing. As wonderful as it has been in the past to kind of work on big things like Star Wars and Walking Dead, and I'm doing a Batman comic right now, and it's fun to kind of play with all the toys in those very wonderful toy boxes. I'm always, you're always aware of the fact that those are other people's toys, right? They're just letting you play with, and sometimes you want to have your own toys where you've got like complete creative autonomy to do whatever you want with them. The problem in Hollywood, which is kind of like my native environment, it's very, very difficult, as I'm sure you know, to get the big kind of flashy, popcorny sci-fi type entertainment that I grew up on and still enjoy writing. It's very, very hard to get original material like that made through the Hollywood system because, we live in a world where everything is Star Wars and Marvel and DC and, these big kind of franchises, comic book adaptations and remakes. And there's very little original sci-fi, at least on kind of a big budget level that gets made, unless you're Christopher Nolan or J.J. Abrams or one of a handful of big filmmakers. It's very difficult to get things like that made, but I still want to tell those stories. So one of the ways that my career has pivoted in the last couple of years has been to try and find other ways to get those stories in front of an audience. Like maybe I'll write a comic book, maybe I'll write a novel, or in this case, maybe I'll write a novel and kind of do my own audiobook adaptation, my own podcast. And that's kind of what this is. Gundog is like a big, won't bore you with kind of the too many like plot details or anything, but it's a big kind of splashy, original, post-apocalyptic alien invasion. Earth has been conquered by these evil race of alien robots. And it's about a young woman who's got a little bit of Skywalker DNA in her, actually kind of grows up, kind of humble origins, but goes on to discover that she's got this grand destiny and is kind of fated to kind of lead the human fight back against the alien oppressors. And it's been a lot of fun developing from scratch. It's all built around the idea of mechs. I'm sure you're very familiar with the kind of big, kind of walking armored war machines. I love those. It always amazed me that as popular as they are in Japan, we've never really seen like much influence of that in Western culture. Like where are our big American and British mechs? Like I want to see that. And so Gundog was kind of my way of scratching that itch. And what I did was I wrote it as an original novel, but I also self-produced my own audiobook adaptation of it. This was kind of like a pandemic project because I work in Hollywood. I'm very fortunate enough to know, actors and composers and people that can help me put it together. So my friend Shannon Woodward, who you might know from HBO's Westworld, and she was in The Last of Us Part 2, very talented actor, and Austin Wintory, who's a very talented composer, just did the soundtrack for a new Netflix film and has done all kinds of amazing video games work, wrote a full orchestral score for it. And what I basically did was I chopped up the audio adaptation into kind of 9-hour-long episodes to kind of serialize it almost like a TV series or a radio series, I guess would be more accurate. And we're broadcasting those episodes live on Twitch every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. You can come to my channel, twitch.tv/Gary Whitta, and I'll introduce each episode and we'll play the audio and people can kind of all listen to a kind of a cool radio show together. And at the end of each episode, I'll come back and do like a Q&A, book club, author discussion, whatever. I'll answer your questions. And it's kind of a fun, interesting new way, I think, to put an original story in front of an audience in kind of a live, serialized format. But for people who can't necessarily come to a channel at 7 p.m. every Wednesday or whatever, it's also going to be available on podcast services. If you just like type Gundog, Gundog into your, kind of podcast engine of choice, all of those episodes are going to be kind of dropped into your podcast feed, just like any other podcast you subscribe to. So it's kind of a fun experiment. The story itself was a lot of fun to write, but it's also been a lot of fun experimenting with a new way to bring a story to market that doesn't necessitate going through all the traditional Hollywood gatekeepers, all the people that will say no, all the people that might write a check to make the project, but then they fire you or replace you, or it gets turned into something, else that you don't recognize anymore. That's very much par for the course in Hollywood, I'm afraid. So this was just kind of a way to like, screw it, I'm just going to do it all myself and no one's going to interfere with me and let's see what happens.
Do you value then that freedom? You must, but I mean, like you say, if you're doing something for a studio or for a network, presumably a dozen people casting their eyes over it and everyone's the smartest guy in the room, so they're all going to have their opinion. To be able to put it out, and this is quite an ingenious way of doing it, do you just love the fact that you can put it out there, but also via this Twitch sort of interface with people, you're getting an immediate reaction to what you're putting out there, but in a different way to some guy in the suit with a clipboard saying, we want more this or we want less that?
Yeah, and it's not that it's not that I have like an inherent problem with the way that Hollywood works. Hollywood's been quite good to me, and I've worked in that business now for more than 20 years. But it's a big budget business, right? And when you're spending 50, 60, 70, $100+ million to make a movie, you understand why the people that are writing those checks become very risk averse. This is why we see a lot of formulaic stuff, right? And a lot of stuff that is based on things that have already proven to be successful in another medium. The example I always give is like, if you think about The Hunger Games, right? That was a big hit book that became a big hit movie. If the writer of The Hunger Games, if Suzanne Collins had written The Hunger Games like as a spec screenplay, I guarantee you no one's ever heard of The Hunger Games because no one makes that movie, right? Because it's crazy. It's like kids killing each other and it's very expensive and like she's riding around in a flaming chariot and, it's all very nutty. But because it was written as a book first and that became a big success, Hollywood was lining up to make the movie. And so it's really just about trying to find smarter ways to get stories in front of an audience that don't involve asking for anyone else's money or permission and don't involve the risk of having the rug pulled out from under you at the last minute. I mean, look at what just happened with Batgirl, right? How it goes out to everyone who worked on that movie for years and sweated bullets only to find out that no one's ever going to see that film. I've been in a similar situation, not as bad as that with a finished film, but like I've worked on movies that 6 weeks from production got canceled by the studio and there's nothing I could do about it. And all that work's wasted. And it's heartbreaking. You work in a creative business and when you write and you create stuff from scratch, right? We do this because we care about telling stories and we love telling stories. It's like, it's not a commercial proposition. It's a creative, emotional thing that we do. And anytime that rug does get pulled out from under you or you get kind of switched around on, it can be really, really devastating. And so I just wanted to try to find a way to tell a story where I mitigated the risk of that happening as much as possible. Like Gundog, no one could pull the rug from under me because I'm the guy holding the rug, right? There is no one else. And so even though I don't have the luxury of like a big marketing budget or whatever, this was all kind of done with shoestring and duct tape. At no point was I ever worried as I fret about on every movie I work on, am I going to get fired and replaced? Is the movie going to get canceled? Are they going to change directors and suddenly it's a whole other different movie? So much is out of your control. I just wanted to have one experience where I didn't have to lay awake, sleepless at night, even one time thinking about any of those things because there was no one else. There was no one that had ultimate control over the project other than myself. And, I worry about, is it going to be a good story? And are people going to like it? And is it going to be successful? And all of those things. But I didn't have the additional worry of, again, are there things out of my control that could end up screwing this up for me? So that in that regard, yeah, it's breath of fresh air, really.
Hello, I'm Warwick Davis, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
Of course, this is going to be a monster hit and it's going to be a game changer. And somebody somewhere is going to say, that'll make a great film.
Well, you've jinxed it now. Thanks.
Well, I've got my fingers crossed so it doesn't count. But let's say we get to that stage. Would you be straight at the front line going, I'd like to be the guy behind the lens directing this one?
Well, I mean, so I come back to what I said about the Hunger Games, right? And it's not. I try not to think about this in a cynical way. For me, the end game is like I've already won in a way, right? Because I know that the story is going to find an audience. It's going to be a podcast. It's going to be on all the social media platforms that I have channels on Twitch and on YouTube. the book is going to be published, right? Literally nobody can stop me from doing those things because I own and control every aspect of it, right? Again, there's no one else to pull the rug. So the fact that I know that the story is going to find an audience and it's going to do so on my own terms, that's already the win, right? I already consider that a win. The cherry on top, the icing on the cake potentially is if, yes, from your mouth to God's ears, let's say it does become super successful as a book, as a podcast, and whatever format I put it out there, then yeah, the likes of, Netflix or Disney or, Universal Studios come and say, ooh, are the screen rights to this available? Because that's how the business works now. And that's why I use the Hunger Games example. Like, again, if I had written Gundog as a screenplay, like $100 million movie, I guarantee you that gets read by maybe 20, 30 executives around town. They all pass on it because no one's going to spend $100 million on something with no brand identity. It's not based on anything. It's not anything that anyone's ever heard of. No one's going to make it, right? And it was a big waste of my time. But if I can go out and demonstrate that there's an audience for this thing, oh, look how many people listen to the podcast. Look how many people bought a copy of the book. Then it becomes a much easier proposition for people in Hollywood who, again, are always looking to kind of mitigate risk, right? It's one thing to spend $100 million on an original science fiction property. That's a big risk, right? Because who knows if anyone's going to show up. But if it's a science fiction property based on a book that was bought by 20 million people or however many people read the Hunger Games or whatever, or Twilight or one of these other big hit things that was a book first, that's a much easier commercial proposition for Hollywood to get their heads around. So yeah, you're right on the money in that. That's not the end game, but it's a nice bonus if that were to happen.
Does that mean then that in your mind, obviously the nature of now how big studios are working with, like, everything needs to be a franchise, are we really as the audience missing out on lots of viewing opportunities to see, these unique stories that may or may not actually get the traction with the audience to then be put in front of the commissioners in the studios?
I guess to some extent, I think the problem's been a little bit overblown. Like a lot of people who are out there saying, oh, like Marvel is bad for films, right? Because they suck up all the oxygen in the room and the only money that's being spent is on these big Marvel and DC type, Harry Potter, these big franchise films, and studios aren't interested in making original stuff. That's kind of always been the case. I think it's always been difficult to get original material through Hollywood. You just have to find the right level for it. Like, look at what Alex Garland does, right? Alex Garland does terrific work. He just does it at a lower budget level, right? Because again, the more money you're asking someone to spend, the bigger check you're asking them to write, the greater their aversion to risk becomes. Like a weird, quirky science fiction movie that costs $5 million to make is not the same proposition as a weird, quirky science fiction movie that costs $50 million to make, right? Sure. And anyone understands how that works. And so you can still get original ideas on screen in film and television. You just have to come at it in a smaller way. My curse is because I grew up on Star Wars and Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica and all this like big stuff. I tend to write big. I tend to write giant robots and big spaceship battles and like things that are very expensive to write. And so rather than change the creative nature of what I do, which would rather than say I should write smaller budget stuff, I still want to write big stuff. It's more about changing how I'm writing it. So like rather than write it as a TV or a movie, maybe I write it as a novel, maybe I write it as a comic, maybe I do it as like an audio thing, because I can still do grand scale, but in a way that is not as expensive to make. So I've kind of like changed the commercial strategy, I guess, but not the creative. I'm still writing the stuff that I want to write, just in a different medium.
So when you're writing Gundog, are you writing primarily the written word, or are you kind of thinking, the scenes which you're playing out in your head, how they would come across in the audio book? Is it a half and half?
To some extent, I can't really kind of help myself from doing that, because that's an ingrained habit that has developed from film being my first language. I've written so many screenplays. Right. When I was writing Rogue One, and I'm writing a space battle, like you can't not close your eyes and like imagine it. Right. And you're seeing spaceships kind of whizzing around in your head. And even if it's just a scene of like two characters having a conversation, like I'll kind of fantasy cast the actors in my head. Right. And imagine, you kind of run your little imaginary, mental movie projector and imagine what that scene would look like on screen. And that's just something you naturally do, and which helps you kind of visualize what it is that you're trying to write, because it is ultimately going to be visualized. But it's interesting, even when I'm writing a novel or something for audio where there is no visual aspect. Yeah. In the back of my head, I'm thinking not just in terms of like, oh, this is what the movie will look like one day, but like you just being able to visualize it in your head helps you describe it on the page. So there's always kind of a movie version of it running in my head, even if it's not a movie that I'm writing. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's how it works for me.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I'm very visual myself as well. So sometimes I can't actually wrap my head around stuff until I see it visually depicted. What was the motivation behind writing a story like this per se? Was there something that you just kind of jumped out to you?
I had such a pop culture diet when I was a kid, right? I read so many comics and watched so many, sci-fi TV shows. I mean, I'm from my accent's kind of gone a bit wobbly after living in the US for so many years, but, I grew up in the UK in the 70s and the 80s. So I grew up on Doctor Who. I grew up on Blake Seven. I grew up on Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And of course we've always had a big, American pop culture diet. Star Wars and Star Trek were as big an influence, to me in the UK as they would have been if I'd have grown up in the US, right? Because those shows had this kind of global footprint. So all of that stuff that I kind of gorged on when I was a kid, it all gets regurgitated years later. Like, this is going to sound silly. I can say this because you guys are Brits and maybe you remember this movie. Americans look at me weird when I think about it. There's a scene in the Book of Eli that only occurred to me years later when I was talking to someone about it the other day, that's kind of inspired by this old movie called Hawk the Slayer that I loved when I was a kid. This kind of cheesy fantasy film from like the early 1980s. And Eli, and specifically, it's interesting. I think all creative people do this, right? They kind of regurgitate and remix the things that they love, like in the same way that Star Wars is this weird mashup of Flash Gordon and Kurosawa, right, and westerns and all these influences that George loved. Like, he kind of found a way to mash up all these pop culture influences and remix it into something totally new. I think we all do that. And, Book of Eli was very much based on the samurai films that I loved when I was growing up and the westerns that I loved when I was growing up. Rogue One is so heavily influenced by the World War II movies that I loved when I was growing up, kind of Men on a Mission, Guns and Navarone, Dirty Dozen, Kelly's Heroes, Where Eagles Dare. Where Eagles Dare was a big one. And, all these things get remixed and kind of mashed up and made new again. And with Gundog, I just love mechs. I just love this idea of, and the funny thing is I've never really spent a lot of time in any particular mech mythology, whether it be like Gundam or Mech Warrior or Robotech or any of this stuff. I just love the idea of it. And I don't know why it's so popular in Japan. I don't know why it's never been a bigger thing in the Western world, because giant robots are cool, right? Like Pacific Rim and stuff like that. We love the idea of these kind of giant colossal war machines kind of slugging it out. And I just always wanted to do something like that. There's also a weird theme of bullying in all of my work and everything, because I was bullied at school because I was a super geek. I was a nerdy kid. This was before being a nerd was cool, right? It's much easier now to be a nerd than it was back in the day. But being into Marvel comics and stuff like that in the 80s when I was a kid, that was not cool. Being into Star Trek was not cool the way it is now, and I got pushed around for it. And it's still something that I think about years later. I have this weird aversion. If I see a bullying storyline in a movie or a TV show, I honestly have a hard time watching it. It's very triggering for me. And that ends up getting filtered into all of my work. What is Star Wars if not a story about standing up to bullies, right? The Empire is a bully, and they're bullying all these planets, and the rebellion is like the plucky little kid. Even though you're much bigger and stronger than me and you're very scary, I'm going to find the courage to stand up to you. Again, that's kind of how I pass it anyway. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper to find it, but in all of my work, you'll find that theme. And Gundog literally has a dedication at the beginning of the book that says, to my parents who taught me to stand up to bullies. And it is that kind of empowerment fantasy. One of the reasons why I've always loved the Incredible Hulk was that idea of that's something we all wish we could do. When I was a kid getting pushed around on the playground, I wish that I could turn into the Incredible Hulk, right, and beat the shit out of that bigger kid. and that empowerment, that's why the Hulk is so popular, right? Because so many kids have that fantasy of suddenly I'm strong, I'm not weak anymore, suddenly I can fight back. And that's kind of what Gundog is. The way the story is structured is this kind of young woman who's kind of the Luke Skywalker of the story, spends the first part of the story kind of running around from the aliens are much stronger and more powerful than her, and she doesn't really have the means to fight back. But once she gets strapped into that 600-ton mech, she's like, well, now I can fight back. Now the tables have turned, and now it's time to go get some payback. That scratches me right where my itch, because again, that's a fantasy that I've had ever since I was 8 years old.
Mark made a really good point earlier about original storytelling compared to franchise storytelling. And there's plenty of original storytelling within franchise sandboxes, if you like. Coming to Rogue One, that was a story that stood out as quite a unique and original Star Wars story. But if that hadn't have been a Star Wars story, do you think you would have still persisted and wanted to get a story like Rogue One out there?
Yeah, now that you think about it, I think I actually already kind of did that. When I was first getting started in screenwriting, I was writing a lot of these spec screenplays in different genres just to kind of see where I felt most comfortable. And like I said, I very much grew up on The Great Escape and The Dirty Dozen and, Guns and Navarone and all those kind of movies. I love those old fashioned World War II men on a mission movies. We've got to parachute into Nazi Germany and go destroy the secret base. And I wrote a movie called Secret Weapons that was very much my kind of tribute, homage to that whole genre. When I was invited to first come in and pitch on Rogue One based on that original kind of John Knoll story idea that he had, I went in and said, And I remember sitting with John and some of the Lucasfilm executives and saying, this is a World War II Men on a Mission movie. This is the Guns of Navarone. This is where Eagles Dare. And I don't know if you remember Eagles Dare, but like Richard Burton and Clint Eastwood have to get dressed up like Nazi officers, right? And infiltrate this kind of Nazi base in the Bavarian Alps. And I remember saying, like, imagine that, but they're dressed up like Imperial officers and they're sneaking around, and secret Imperial base, trying to steal the plans. Like, it's all of that stuff that we love from those World War II movies, but like in a Star Wars context. Like, that's my lens through which I see this film. Later on, I got the job. And after I got the job, John said, come into my office, and he showed me this book that he had made, this presentation that he had given to Kathy Kennedy prior to my involvement, because that was the initial conversation, right? John wanted to do a standalone story about the rebels stealing the Death Star plans. And that was the idea that he took to Kathy. And when he showed her his presentation, and which he later showed to me, all of his references images were from the Guns of Navarone and the Dirty Dozen. As he and I both saw the movie in the same way, as kind of a reframing of those old classic World War II movies. So that's largely the reason why I got the job, is because John and I think both kind of saw the movie in the same way in terms of those classic cinematic references.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds, bookmark FanthaTracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
Now Rogue One's been out there for 6 years now, and is so well respected and viewed by fans and even people from outside the Star Wars sort of realm of fandom. People just appreciate that film. How do you feel about it now, 6 years removed, now that your career has moved on, you're doing other things? But how do you sort of look back on that time now? Because for the company, it was a time of massive change, new storytelling coming in, expanding the brief of what they wanted to do with Star Wars. And you were, on the leading edge of that for a good long while. How do you feel about it now, looking back?
I mean, it's incredibly gratifying. And I always try to, whenever anyone asks me a question like this, I always try to preface it by stating that, I'm aware of the fact that my contribution to the movie was relatively small, right? These movies are made by hundreds and hundreds of people. And even though Gareth and I were like literally the first two people hired on the movie, and a lot of the foundational story stuff that he and I developed is still kind of the core of the film, even in terms of just the writing, right? I'm one of only 4 credited writers on the film, and there were others beyond that as well. Believe me, like oftentimes writers don't even get credit. So a lot of writers contribute to that movie, but I'm aware of what my contribution was, and I do think it's there. It's kind of baked into the mythology and the storytelling in the film. So I take pride in it. I just don't get carried away with like, oh, that's my movie, because like so many other people played a massive part in making it what it is. Like Chris Weitz, who was one of the writers that wrote the final version of the screenplay, like brought so much to it that I never even would. Like sometimes people come up to me and say, oh, I love Chirrut and Baze. I'm like, talk to Chris Weitz because he created those characters. I love them too, but they weren't my idea, and that kind of stuff. But no, it's wonderful, right? So there's been 5 films that have come out of Lucasfilm in the Disney era, right? Yeah. The 3 trilogy films and the 2 standalones. And anytime they do like a poll or whatever, I think IGN just did a poll recently, like, what's your favorite movie from the new era? And Rogue One won it by like a country mile. Like it wasn't even close. And just every now and again, my Twitter feed starts blowing up. And I'm like, what's going on? Why am I getting tagged into all of these posts? It's because Rogue One is trending again. Like every 3 or 6 months or whatever, someone will post it like a scene of like Darth Vader in the hallway or whatever, or someone will just say like random Rogue One appreciation thread or whatever it might be. Like it keeps, for some reason, it keeps resurfacing. And I think because there is this tremendous fondness for it. And given how nervous we all were when I first went, it was, oh my God, it's Star Wars, like it's pop culture landmark. The piece, the one piece that we're doing is like directly attached to the original film that started it all. Like there's so much at stake here. We cannot mess this up. I was so nervous about it. The fact that it came out as well as it did, and it is, I think, among the more highly regarded of certainly of the Disney films, but like in the canon overall, I've had people come up to me and say like it's my favorite #1 Star Wars film, and even I, who worked on it, I'm like, come on. We've got to talk about The Empire Strikes Back, surely. But those people that like put it in like top 3 of like all 9, or I guess all 10 films, all 11 films, technically. It's
13 if you involve the Ewok films. Don't forget.
Don't forget who can forget Caravan of Courage. The fact that the dust settled as well as it did, and people are so fond of it, and again every now and again like it kind of regains traction on social media, or someone will post like an appreciation or whatever. No, it's great. I mean, I couldn't be more thrilled.
You mentioned the tension when you're prepping something like this. Did the weight of your own expectation weigh on you, because you grew up similar age to me, I guess, grew up in the 70s and 80s watching all that sci-fi as kind of a golden era, and certainly in the 80s, once Next Gen came on, it kind of went nuts. But, you're soaking all these things in and taking it all on board, and you take all the little constituent elements and fold it into the Star Wars galaxy, which you loved anyway. Did you feel the pressure? Did you feel the pressure of others? And what I'm trying to say is, was that a healthy pressure because it paid off?
It was. It didn't feel healthy at the time. I gained a lot of weight. It didn't help that our office where Gareth and I worked was right around the back of a Starbucks, and we kept like getting all the baked goods from Starbucks. And I had to take anti-anxiety medication at one point. Like, I'm not kidding. It was, but all the stress was on me from within me. I remember when they first announced that I was involved in the film, there was like a big press release that went out. And again, my phone started blowing up and people are contacting me. The most common theme in those kind of messages was like, first congratulatory, like, oh my God, this is amazing, Star Wars, oh my God, you've made it. And then, but there was always like, and then afterwards, don't fuck this up. And then, and that ended up being the mantra that I had for the next, year or two that I worked on the film. Because again, I was so aware of the fact that, this is so visible. Like, everyone's going to see this film. Steven Spielberg's going to see this film. George Lucas is going to see this film. The Book of Eli was a cool movie. Maybe you saw it, maybe you didn't. Star Wars, everybody sees, and everyone brings so much expectation to it. And because it was the first film to kind of break out of the Skywalker saga mold and do its own thing, we didn't have an opening crawl, right? We didn't have the fanfare. It started to kind of change the language of what Star Wars was. Like, we were aware of all of that. And I was terrified that we were going to screw it up. And again, none of that came from outside. Kathy Kennedy and Kiri Hart, who was kind of my immediate boss when I was working there, they were all like, don't worry, like, have fun, like, write the Star Wars movie that you want to make and we'll support you. And they were wondering through the whole process. Like, they never said, don't fuck this up. Because I think it's not helpful or productive to say that, right? It's counterproductive. But like, in my head, like, I could never really silence that voice of like just being, and again, there's that inner 12-year-old behind me, right? That same 11-year-old kid that walked out Return of the Jedi when I was a kid, just so blown away, is now looking over my shoulder saying, oh my God, this is amazing. You're writing dialogue for Darth Vader. But he's also saying like, this better be good. And so I could never really get that out of my head. And I don't know if it in any way affected the work. I just know that it was a thing that I constantly felt like literally like laying awake at night, 3:00 in the morning, worrying about like, is this going to be good or am I going to screw it up? Because I was fully aware of the fact that I would probably my whole life never do anything as visible as a Star Wars film.
How do you, when you're writing something like Rogue One, have fun when the back of your mind, and probably everybody is saying, don't fuck this up? I mean, if it was me, I would have texted you, would have congratulated you, and then I would have asked, can you get me a part in the film? And then say, don't fuck this up.
I mean, there was certainly some as that as well. But yeah, the don't fuck this up was definitely the number one trending topic. Yeah, I mean, every now and again, I mean, there are times when like you can't not feel the magic of it. The offices where we worked, because Gareth and I mostly worked out of the Lucasfilm office here in San Francisco in the Presidio. We were down in a basement in some unused office that they had found space for us in. And it really was kind of like working at, like Wernham Hogg. It doesn't feel glamorous in that regard. But then you walk across the hallway where ILM is, and they've got, I remember like writing that scene of Darth Vader's fortress on Mustafar, the Vader's castle. We would go over to ILM and they had it like drawn up on the boards, like painted, and it looked incredible. I was like, oh my God, like this stuff is coming to life before my very eyes from like ILM. And it is like the best artists in the world. And it was just absolutely amazing. And just little things like you'd go upstairs to the cafeteria, like the public kind of facing part of Lucasfilm, because, that part of it's open to the public and you can walk in and take pictures, next to Yoda and stuff like that. And every now and again, like a school group would come through and they would see like R2-D2 in the lobby and just freak out. And I remember thinking, wow, no, this is, you forget, but like they have little reminders like this is magic. Never been truer than with something like Star Wars, but like the work that I get to do making these kind of movies, especially like science fiction and fantasy, and putting stuff up on the screen where you kind of take someone to another world and they forget their reality for a couple of hours. You get to go to a galaxy far, far away. That's the closest thing in the world that exists to actual magic. And when you're reminded of that, that is kind of what that ultimately supersedes the stress, because you realize just how lucky you are to be doing that for a living.
Is there a moment in that film? Is there a sequence? Is there a turn of events that you look back and your DNA fingerprints all over it that you get a proper buzz from?
Vader's castle is definitely cool. I remember saying to Gareth, like I really wanted to write the movie that Gareth was excited about making. And I would talk all the time about the parts of Star Wars that he liked. And he loves that scene in The Empire Strikes Back when the officer walks in and Vader's still putting his helmet on. You know, you get that tiny little glimpse of like what's under there. And you go, oh my God, like what does he look like underneath the helmet? And he loves that scene. How could we do like a version of that? And so so we came up with this idea that, you know, every now and again, because Vader, the prequels had already come out at that point, right? So we know what's under the armor. And so I remember thinking like his body is so physically ruined and such a kind of physical wreck that machine, that suit of armor that he's wearing is basically keeping him alive. That I just had this idea that every now and again, all the armor has to come off and he kind of has to like regenerate or rejuvenate or whatever. So they put him in the back to tank and he goes to like, I used to call it Vader's day spa. That was kind of the joke. And I like the idea of like, because he's so formidable, right? When you think about Vader, you think about him in the hallway at the end. You think about him, you know, fighting Obi-Wan Kenobi, and you think about like, you know, he's a terrifying force, right? He's 7 foot tall machine monster. But what's under all that armor is actually quite pathetic, right? This broken, you know, half torso of a man. And I like the idea of kind of reminding people, especially again, we have the luxury of knowing that we've seen Return of the Jedi, we know ultimately what happens to Vader. That I like the idea of kind of reminding audiences that as fearsome as he is, what's under the armor is still basically kind of the pathetic remains of Anakin Skywalker. And that scene was rendered so beautifully that I remember thinking, yeah, that happened because I had that idea, and that was so cool. I guess the other main thing, and this is kind of like me and Gareth jointly, we were sitting around talking about a way to kind of personalize the need to find the Death Star plans. And I don't remember exactly what the eureka moment was, but we were literally kind of like sitting around on those kind of Dunder Mifflin couches like late at night, and it was like, what if the floor is there because her dad put it there and he designed the Death Star? Like, it's not just some engineering oversight. That exhaust port was deliberately put there because the scientist who built it was trying to find a way to undo what he had been forced to make and try to give the rebels a way to destroy it. And that was kind of the big light bulb moment. And that ended up informing everything that we did afterwards. And of course, that's still, you know, kind of the heart of the movie.
Hey man, it's me, Kevin Smith, a Star Wars fan, Fantha Tracks fan.
Animal Crossing, I mentioned it earlier. Tell us a bit about that. I've never played it. I don't know much about it, but I do know you had an involvement with it.
I had this kind of weird, you know, during the pandemic, we were all bored, right? Especially during the dog days of the pandemic when we were locked down and couldn't go anywhere. I mean, I still feel like I can't really go anywhere. Like, it's still far from over. But, you know, back in like 2020, when it was really biting down hard, we were all desperate, and everyone's going out and baking bread and like buying webcams or, you know, and playing video games. And Animal Crossing in particular was like, it was such a big hit because it was like the perfect game for the pandemic, right? Like everyone was stuck at home, but you could go to this cutesy, you know, tropical island filled with cute animal characters and stuff, and it was just an escape from the dreariness of our reality. And I had started streaming on Twitch around that time. I had my own little Twitch channel, and I was playing Animal Crossing on it, and people were watching me play, and I was just kind of goofing around. And you can kind of, you know, design your house and rearrange the furniture in your house and stuff like this. And I had this spare room, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I can't remember what the genesis point of it was, but it was like, would it be possible to like do a like a cool recreation of like a late night talk show set, like with the furniture that the game has on offer? Do like, you know, the old Johnny Carson Tonight Show where, you know, you've got like the desk and the couch and the band and the, you know, the curtain and all that kind of stuff. Everyone knows what a late night talk show looks like. And I was like, could we recreate that? And I did it on stream, and we like found a couch and a desk that looked right and wallpaper that seemed to fit. And by the time it was done, it actually looked really good. It was like, man, this really looks like a talk show set. And I was like, well, man, now that I've got it, we've kind of got to do something with it, right? And so I called up a couple of friends of mine and said, do you want to like, you know, like play dress up, like play talk show? Like, I'll be the host and you can pretend to be a guest, and we streamed out this show, the first episode of the show that was called Animal Talking, where I got to pretend to be a talk show host, and I would have guests on and tell me about your new book. You know, I understand you brought a clip from your new movie, and we were just like goofing around. But the audience on Twitch that was watching it was loving it. They thought it was hilarious. And so we kept doing it. We did another show and another show, and we got more ambitious with it. And we found ways to kind of make the show better, and, you know, little things like camera placement and lighting. Like how can we make the show better every week? It kind of became like a hobby project. And then at one point, Twitch got wind of it and saw that what we were doing was really cool. And they put us on the front page of Twitch so that everyone saw it one episode. And then it kind of blew up, and we actually started to get inquiries from like actual like Hollywood talent bookers that wanted to get their celebrity guests on the show, because none of the other talk shows were even like really on at that point, right? Because it was the pandemic. Like, no one, like, the talk shows were all dark, or they were doing them from their broom closets. Like, there wasn't really anything going on. And a lot of celebrities, they couldn't shoot their movies, right? Because the movie sets were shut down. They were just sitting around like looking for something to do. And so like we started to book actual celebrities on the show, and they got a real kick out of being on this video game talk show. And by the time we were done, like we were booking guests that were as big as like you'd find on any talk show in the world. Like we had Selena Gomez on the show. We had Brie Larson. We had Sting come on and sat on our couch and played live music.
Crazy.
It was ridiculous. Yeah. And it went to this insane level. And we got more ambitious, and we found a way to like pipe live music into the show. So we did have live music playing. We had live stand-up comedy. We would do like scripted segments and all kinds of comedy bits and stuff like that. And it just became this really, really fun thing to do. And you can still go, all the episodes are still on my YouTube channel. You can go to youtube.com/Gary Whitta, and there's like a whole animal talking playlist. So I think we did like 25 episodes. And it was just hugely fun. And it really was just meant to be something that put a smile on people's faces during the pandemic. And it ended up getting way out of hand again with like these kind of A-list celebrity guests. And suddenly I'm having to talk to people about like clearing music, for copyright purposes. And it started actually, frankly, to become a big hassle. I wasn't getting paid to do it, but it was like taking up half of my week, and I have a day job. This became like this really hobby kind of metastasized and ended up taking up all of my time. So eventually I had to stop doing it. But for the short time that we did it in 2020, it was hilarious.
There's something quite fun, isn't there, about unfortunately the dark side of a pandemic, isn't it? That all these amazing creative people had all the spare time in their hands, so you could do these kind of things. And it's going to be like a snapshot in history. I think whilst it's really horrible and everybody suffered for it, but it gave all these really bizarre avenues for people to be creative and give back to various different communities, which is fantastic.
Yeah, there's a ton of, if you remember, even before the pandemic, during the writer's strike, there was a ton of cool projects that people did just because Hollywood, they couldn't do anything, so they just went off and kind of made their own little hobby projects. And certainly there was a ton of like we had one of our guests on Animal Talking was Josh Gad, who had done his own pandemic show. I think it was called like Reunited Apart or something like that, where he would like reunite on Zoom, like the casts of like classic movie, or the cast of Back to the Future would all get back together on Zoom. And so again, everyone was kind of like just trying to amuse themselves, right? Because again, they couldn't go shoot their movies or their TV shows. And we were just looking for something to do. So there was a ton of like creative people will find ways to make things like even under like the most restrictive conditions. And like Animal Talking was my version of that. And in a weird way, I guess, it kind of led to, what we're doing with Gundog on Twitch, because I built that audience from Animal Talking. And it was a great example of, you could use this platform in a different way. Like Twitch is predominantly known, you watch people play video games on it, right? And that's something that people enjoy doing. But there's all kinds of other things. You can watch people do cooking streams and, comedy and music and stuff like that. And it was like, part of the reason why I'm doing this thing on Twitch where we're doing Gundog is these like weekly live, almost like radio broadcasts where people can kind of tune in and together and kind of listen along with the author was, I don't know if I would have had that idea if Animal Talking hadn't happened, but Animal Talking kind of opened my eyes to the fact that was a platform where you could do something different and kind of innovate and like do a weird experiment. And if it doesn't work, who cares? You tried something. But if it does, in the case of Animal Talking, if it does and it blows up, brilliant.
Would you or could you be up for doing a Star Wars version of this, like a chapterized live audio recording of a Gary Whitta story?
It's funny because I haven't done, aside from the fact that some of the Star Wars, I've got stories in both of the Certain Point of View books that came out. They've done Star Wars and Empire. I think Jedi they haven't done yet, but those got turned into audio books. And so, it was kind of fun to hear my story being read back to me by a kind of professional audiobook performer. But yeah, audio, it's funny how like the internet, like everything old is new again, right? Like everyone's going, podcasting, like audio drama. This is the new space. I'm like, yeah, I remember when that was just called radio. Right. Like they had that in the 1930s. Like there's nothing new about this idea. It's just coming at you through a new medium. So, but as you know, of course, going back to the original Star Wars, right? There was that tremendous NPR audio adaptation that they did. Right. So there's always been kind of a rich history of that. And I when I was working on Rogue One, not for research, just because I thought it was cool, I found this old audio drama that I think was called like Adventure on Ord Mantell or something like that. It was like this old radio.
Ord Mantell.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and that's cool. And I listened to some of that, and there is this tremendous history of Star Wars and audio. I don't know to what extent they're exploring that space right now, but again, that kind of narrative podcast scene is blowing up really big right now. So if I was working at Lucasfilm, I'd probably be saying like we should be developing some audio dramas because this is a big opportunity right now.
It's a great idea. It's a great fertile ground to get new things out there, isn't it? And you haven't got to worry about the budget for making giant robots or Death Stars.
Yeah. Plus you've got Skywalker sound, right? What podcast is going to sound better than that?
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm really pleased we've been able to do this, and hopefully let's speak again somewhere down the line.
Yeah, this was great. Thanks so much for having me. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to Making Tracks. If you want to be a part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit fanthatracks.com or check out the free Fanthatracks app through the App Store to follow us on your mobile device. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@fanthatracks.com. Comment, like and share on any of our social media feeds at Fanthatracks, and be sure to subscribe, leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. And as always, thanks to James Semper for composing the Fanthatracks intro, Adam O'Brien for our Making Tracks only music, and Mark Daniel and Vanessa Marshall for our voiceovers. Remember, tune in to Good Morning Tatooine. It's live Sunday evenings, 9 o'clock UK time, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific on Facebook and YouTube. And check out our Fanthatracks Radio Friday night rotation every Friday night at 7 o'clock UK time for new episodes of The Fantha from Down Under, Planet Leia, There's a Planet Discs, Start Your Engines, Collecting Tracks, Cannon Fodder, and special episodes of Making Tracks. And coming up next, it's Making Tracks at Droid Builders UK 2022. See you next time.
Coming up next on Fanthatracks Radio, it's another episode of Making Tracks.